The guard looked at her as if she were invisible, or worse, as if she were a nuisance to be quietly removed from the path. Naomi Carter tried to explain, in a low, measured voice, that she had an appointment inside the Vatican. She showed her leather folder, but a single glance at her curly hair, tied back with a blue cotton scarf, and at her dark skin glistening under the Roman sun, was enough for him to decide she was lying. Without raising his voice, he simply nodded his head. Two other men appeared beside him, and before she could utter a word, she was being pulled out of the line for the Sistine Chapel, in front of dozens of tourists who watched with that silence that says everything without saying anything. She could feel their stares piercing her like arrows, people from many countries, phones in hand and cameras around their necks, pretending not to see. Some laughed quietly. Others simply looked away, as if her humiliation were a minor inconvenience in their travel itinerary. Naomi tried to maintain her composure. She lowered her eyes. She gripped the strap of her bag. But inside, something shattered violently. It wasn't the first time she'd been treated as someone who didn't belong. But here, in the city where faith should be greater than prejudice, what no one there knew, neither the guards nor the tourists nor the priest who hurried past without noticing, was that Naomi Carter was not there as a tourist. She had been personally invited by Pope Francis to participate in a global initiative on inclusion and social justice. She was one of only 5 people selected worldwide, and the only black woman. Inside the folder she carried was a letter bearing the golden seal of the Holy See, signed in the Pope's own hand. But in that moment, all of that seemed as distant as the altar she would never reach. If you've ever been disbelieved before you even opened your mouth, if you've ever felt the weight of silent judgment on your skin, this story is for you. Comment below where you're watching from, subscribe to the channel, and prepare to understand how the silence of a black woman became the force that made the Vatican listen, for the first time in a very long time. Naomi Carter woke up every day at 5:30 in the morning, even when she didn't have to. It was her mother's habit, which she carried in her bones like a silent inheritance. She lived in Harlem, New York, in a small apartment that was organized down to the smallest detail. Books, stacked by theme, cinnamon incense burning quietly in the corner of the living room, a shelf of framed photos of black women who made history: Angela Davis, Rosa Parks, Toni Morrison, her mother. At 38, Naomi was an African-American history professor at Columbia, but before any title, she was the daughter of a housekeeper who rode 3 buses across the city to clean houses where no one knew her name. Her classes were different. Naomi didn't use PowerPoint or stay behind a desk. She told stories, stories that hurt, stories that healed, stories that made students look at themselves in the mirror. She spoke about slave ships with the same passion she spoke about grandmothers hiding books under their beds. For her, each class was an act of resistance. The students knew it, and perhaps that was why they respected her so much. But outside the classroom, things weren't always like that. Naomi had been turned away at the entrance of her own university for wearing an oversized hoodie and letting her hair hang loose. She had been ignored at academic events where she was the only black person at the table, and though she had learned to keep her calm, those scars piled up. The Vatican invitation arrived like a sigh after exhausting months. She had been nominated by a Latin American organization that had followed her educational projects in at-risk areas. In the sealed envelope, the Pope's signature didn't seem real, but it was. She was invited to take part in a roundtable on faith, social justice, and historical reparations. Naomi hesitated to accept. She knew she wasn't welcome everywhere. She also knew that, even with an official invitation, she might be treated as invisible. But something inside her told her she had to go, that it was time to occupy that space. Before the trip, Naomi went to visit her mother's grave. She brought white flowers. She stood in silence for several minutes, and when she finally spoke, it was just one sentence. "I am going, Mom. For you. For me and for all of us they try to silence." On the flight to Rome, she reread the letter about 10 times. She memorized every word, but none of them seemed enough to shield her from what was coming. She didn't yet know that in less than 48 hours, her presence would be cruelly questioned, and her response, silent, firm, and laden with centuries of ancestral pain, would change everything. Rome seemed suspended in time. The cobblestone streets, the smell of fresh coffee, the bells echoing from church. Domes like constant reminders that here everything was sacred. Naomi arrived early, so early that the sun was only just grazing the stones of Via della Conciliazione. She walked alone, leather folder firm under her arm, her steps light with purpose. It wasn't her first time traveling alone to another country, but there was something different about that day, something that made her uneasy. She tried to breathe deeply, repeating the words she'd rehearsed for the meeting. She was there on behalf of women like her mother, like her students, like all those who had been taught to be silent in spaces of power. When she reached the side entrance of the Sistine Chapel, where she was supposed to meet a representative of the organizing committee, Naomi found a line of tourists stretching along the sidewalk. She decided to ask one of the Swiss guards about the guest entrance. He didn't hear her, or pretended not to. She tried again, more firmly this time. The man looked her up and down as if trying to decipher whether she really had cause to be there. She opened her bag, took out the envelope with the golden Vatican seal. Before she could show it, he cut her off. "Tourist entrance is over there. Line up, please." Naomi inhaled deeply. She said politely that she was there for an official engagement. "I was invited. I have a letter signed by the Pope himself." He laughed. Not a loud laugh, but one that slipped out at the corner of his mouth full of contempt. Two more guards approached. One of them motioned to lead her away, and that was exactly what happened. Naomi was removed from the entrance as if she'd been trying to break some rule. No one spoke up. None of the dozens of people in line, with their eyes, their cameras, their travel itineraries, intervened. The silence around her was deafening. The only thing she could hear was her own heart pounding and the muffled sound of footsteps on marble as they escorted her away from the main entrance. They stopped beside a low wall. There Naomi stood with her folder in her hands, while one of the guards spoke into his radio in Italian. She couldn't understand the words, but the tone was clear. They were trying to verify if she was telling the truth. In that moment, Naomi didn't know whether to cry, to scream, or simply turn her back and walk away. But an image flashed into her mind. Her mother, kneeling on the floor of the house where she cleaned, whispering to her as a child, "Be greater than their contempt." So she stood there, upright, head held high, no apologies, eyes fixed on the gilded entrance from which they had just expelled her. The silence surrounding Naomi was broken by quick, light footsteps. A young priest, dressed in an immaculate white cassock with a silver cross hanging from his chest, approached the guards with a tense expression. He spoke Italian rapidly, discreetly pointing to Naomi and then to one guard's radio. She didn't understand the exchange, but she sensed something had changed. The guard who had earlier ignored her now kept his eyes on the ground. The other avoided eye contact. The priest then turned to her, removed his cap courteously, and said in calm, respectful English, "Dr. Carter, I am terribly sorry. We had not been informed that you would arrive this way. Please follow me." Naomi froze for a second. Her body was still processing the humiliation, but she nodded, clutching the folder to her chest, and followed him in silence. They walked through a side entrance she would never have noticed, past corridors of ancient stone, rooms with frescoed walls, stained glass windows casting patches of colored light across the cold floors. Everything was beautiful, everything was silent, but she still felt the ache throbbing in her heart. The priest tried to make conversation, explaining that the committee members were already waiting for her, that the Pope had personally insisted on reading her work, that her words would be heard. Naomi only nodded. She still couldn't smile. When they reached a small antechamber near the private auditorium, she was greeted by two nuns. They carefully took her bag, offered her water, and one of them held her hands for a moment, whispering, "They don't see you, but we do." Naomi looked at her with tears welling up. She didn't cry, not yet, but it was in that simple touch, that silent recognition, that she felt maybe it had been worth coming after all. At the center of the round table sat ecclesiastical figures from various countries, cardinals, theologians, community leaders. Naomi was the only black woman, the only lay person, but her name sat at the highest seat at the table on a white placard that read, "Dr. Naomi Carter, United States." Before the official start, one of the cardinals asked for the floor. He recounted what had happened at the entrance. He told how she had been stopped, disbelieved, humiliated, but how, nonetheless, she was there, standing. with dignity, and that this spoke more about her than any title ever could. He offered the institution's apology, out loud, in front of everyone, and for the first time in many years, Naomi felt that the pain she carried was being recognized, not only as a wound, but as strength. The room fell into a profound silence when Naomi stood up. She walked slowly to the light wood podium, her steps measured, the sound of her heels echoing softly on the stone floor. Her hands trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the weight she bore. The weight of every door she'd had to knock on twice, of every gaze that measured her before hearing her. She paused at the microphone, took a deep breath, and let her eyes survey the dozens of faces before her. Cardinals, priests, theologians, representatives from around the world, all expecting a technical lecture on faith and education. But Naomi hadn't traveled all that way to present statistics. She had come to deliver the truth she had carried in her chest since childhood. "I almost gave up on speaking today," she began, her voice low but steady, "because just hours ago I was made to feel that I didn't belong in this place, that my presence was a mistake." A soft murmur rippled through the room. "I was removed from the entrance. They looked at me as if I were lying, as if someone like me could never have been invited." She paused, glanced down at her hands, then looked back at them. "But I am not here because someone let me in. I am here because my ancestors never stopped knocking on doors that said they were closed to them." She spoke for nearly 20 minutes, no notes, no slides, just her voice and the living story in every sentence. She spoke of her mother, who spent her life cleaning houses where no one knew her name. She spoke of her students in Harlem, children who asked whether God looked like them. She spoke about silence, about how much it hurts to be ignored, about the faith that survives even when buried beneath generations of exclusion. And as she spoke, her pain filled the room like an invisible incense, soft, dense, impossible to ignore. No one interrupted her. No one averted their eyes. One cardinal dabbed at his eyes with a handkerchief. A young nun tightened her grip on her rosary beads. An African delegate nodded, tears streaming down his face. Naomi's pain had become a mirror, and in it, everyone saw what they had long refused to acknowledge. When she finished, she did not offer a formal thank you. She did not smile. She simply said, "For every time they told us to be silent, today we speak. For every door they closed, today we walk through." And she returned to her seat, her eyes fixed on the golden cross at the back of the room. She did not need applause, but it came anyway, slow, respectful, like a prayer finally answered after so long. 2 days after that speech, the video of Naomi's address was published on the official channels of the Holy See. Uncut, unedited, just a fixed camera capturing her voice, her eyes, and every word she cast into that hall like seeds of a new era. In less than 24 hours, the video had surpassed 2 million views. People on every continent shared clips of her talk, tagging universities, priests, entire communities. Hashtags sprang up spontaneously. "Let Naomi speak," "Faith in color," "We belong here." For the first time, Naomi saw the world respond not with silence, but with listening. She received invitations from religious institutions in Brazil, South Africa, and France. They asked for her presence. They wanted to hear her. More than that, they wanted to learn. But Naomi did not let herself be lulled by easy applause. She continued living in Harlem. She continued teaching at Columbia. She continued sitting on the floor with her youngest students to discuss the history that books still fail to tell correctly. But something inside her had changed. What was once pain carved in silence was now a verb. It was action. It was cause. And she knew this was not just about her. It was about all the voices echoing through her mouth. Months later, she returned to the Vatican, this time as the chair of a permanent commission on racial justice within the church itself. Upon entering, no one stopped her. No one doubted her. One of the guards, the same man who had once ignored her, opened the door with a slight nod, as if finally recognizing who she was. Naomi strode down the marble corridor with the calm steps of someone who no longer needed to prove anything. When she reached the meeting room, she set her folder on the table, and before sitting pulled a small photograph of her mother from her pocket, already yellowed with age. She placed it beside the nameplate in front of her, and she smiled. She knew she would not change the world alone. But in that gesture, in that image between her name and the seat she had earned, lay everything that mattered: memory, resistance, and faith. And when asked in an airport interview what she would take away from the experience, she answered, in a gentle voice, her eyes brimming with tears, "Some say God does not see color. I disagree. I believe he sees every color, every pain, and every story. And today, he saw me.